Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to part 11 of my Joseph Losey season. And today we're going to talk about The Criminal from 1960. Nazar and Prod recently did a Stanley Baker triple bill video, which I'll leave a link to in the description, and one of the films he talked about was Losey's The Criminal. This is a film that, not surprisingly, if you've been following the Losey series, Losey didn't get on with the producer. Obviously we kind of sympathise with Losey because of the blacklisting, but I think he was a fairly complicated individual, and the producer is quoted as saying that Losey was somewhat Machiavellian. The script was originally written by Jimmy Sangster and was kind of offered by Hammer, but Losey wasn't a fan of the script, and they got Alan Jones involved, and he wrote the script for the film. Now originally Losey made a 130-minute cut. Eventually it got trimmed down to 97, 98. And then it wasn't until 1962 it got released in the United States under the name The Concrete Jungle, and at that point it was down to 86 minutes. So even in this 98-minute edition, because sadly we'll never see the 130-minute cut unless we get a miracle and it's somehow found somewhere, it does have the feel of a film that has been cut down. So it was allegedly about 35 minutes that get taken out of it, so then it does kind of have that feel. But what we have is a cornucopia of British actors in the 50s and 60s and 70s. We have Patrick Magee, Patrick Wymark, Edward Judd, Tom Bell, Murray Melvin, Rupert Davis, Nigel Green. Did I mention Nigel Green? The wonderful Nigel Green. So there's lots of familiar faces. Even if you don't recognise the names, you'll recognise the faces. And this is half and half a prison film and life on the outside. We're introduced to Stanley Baker's character on the day before his release, and a famous stool pigeon comes back into prison, and obviously Stanley Baker wants to do damage to him, but Patrick Magee's prison officer character tells him no rough stuff. That doesn't necessarily happen. And within like the first 10-15 minutes, Losey really gives a wonderful view of the prison hierarchy, because Losey, one of his obsessions in films is kind of the establishment and looking at the different stratas of establishment and the kind of relationship between classes. If you saw the last video in the series, Blind Date, with Stanley Baker as well, as a kind of working class police inspector, Losey looks at the kind of strata even in the police force in that film as far as class, and he kind of shows really effectively and fairly quickly the kind of hierarchy within the prison, around inmates. If you're a fan of Ronnie Barker, you could actually argue that The Criminal is a forerunner to Ronnie Barker's wonderful sitcom Porridge, which was set in the fictional Slade prison. And really all the archetypes from Porridge are really in The Criminal, as far as the kind of kingpin in the prison. There's a mix of ethnicities, which we also saw in Porridge. So if you're familiar with Porridge, the criminal actually is an interesting little forerunner, obviously not a comedy. We do see the kind of issues with mental health from the prison side, even although there's a sense of realism about this film. There's also a lot of really stylistic flourishes by Losey, including one moment where a prisoner, they're talking about we're all villains in here, and one of the prisoners says, yeah, but I'm not, I'm a bit different, and then there's literally a spotlight, the background lights get turned down, and the camera kind of closes in on this character, and he's almost talking to the audience, talking about, I'm insane, and you don't know what that's like. And then of course the camera pulls back and the lights kind of come on, so it's a really stylized moment in a quote unquote realistic film, which is kind of interesting. So Baker gets out, and Patrick McGee's character, who is, again, back to Porridge, is very similar to Fulton Mackay's prison officer. He says, don't worry, because he'll be back. And again, Patrick McGee's character is very interesting because he kind of has this strange relationship. Again, he lets some things go, and there's a definite kind of ebb and flow and give and take with the prisons and the prisoners and the prison guards. Anyway, Baker comes out. He's greeted by Sam Wanamaker, who's, I believe, the only American in the cast. And he's a very kind of, not sleazy, but definitely, well, he's a criminal, but a very shady kind of character that obviously Baker doesn't really trust, isn't really comfortable around him. So they go to this party back at Baker's pad. His ex-girlfriend turns up, who he obviously doesn't want anything to do with, and she kind of figures in a little bit of the plot, which I won't go into. And he goes to bed, but again, there's nice little touches, like he has a portable like tanning light, so it's a different kind of criminal. There's a wonderful scene where he has a piano tuner in, so he's got like a piano tuner, he has a portable tanning light, which in 1960 I'm not sure how common they were. So he goes to bed, but there's a woman in his bed, Margit Saad, S-A-A-D. I'm not exactly sure what the proper pronunciation of that is. And she says she wants to be alone with the famous Johnny Banyan. It's obviously Stanley Baker's character. And she's very kind of aggressive about wanting, to get to know him a bit better. And you can actually see Stanley Baker, this hard man, who we see in the prison almost like taking delight in the kind of power he has. You can actually see him being a little bit uncomfortable because here's a woman that's actually kind of taking charge of the situation, and they eventually have a relationship. So as he comes out of prison, he has planned this robbery that's going to make him and his crew rich, strangely enough, because criminals don't tend to plan robberies that's going to make them poor. And amongst the crew is Nigel Green, who has a smaller part. He could have given Nigel Green a bigger part because he's fantastic as always. And Sam Wanamaker is kind of the middleman between Baker's crew and the kind of Lord of the Manor, if you like, who we never really see, because you have to get permission and bankroll and stuff like that. So the robbery goes fine, but Losey's not really interested in the robbery. Baker hides the money in a field somewhere, as you do, until the heat blows over. And I mentioned the word heat because this film, there's actually some commonality with Michael Mann's Thief, in the sense of the idea of criminals or robbers and it being more of a business and being involved in more of a company with like management levels rather than the loner, the man alone, the craftsman. Because again, the more people that you have to get permission or bankrolls jobs, then obviously the more chance of being caught, the more chance of getting into trouble. So it has that kind of element of Michael Mann's Heat as well, which obviously wouldn't be made until 1981. So that's a kind of interesting little thing to think about when you're watching The Criminal as well. Porridge and Michael Mann's Thief. But at some point, Stanley Baker goes and gets some of the money, and he is caught, but somebody's tipped off the police, and he ends up back in prison, and pressure is put on him from inside the prison and outside the prison to give up where the money is, and this also involves pressure being put on his new girlfriend, Suzanne, played by Margaret Said, or Sad, I'm not quite sure. And again, I'll just leave it there. How does he get out of prison? Does he get these guys off his back? Does he live happily ever after with Suzanne and the money from his ill-gotten gains? You'll have to watch the film to find out. But again, this is a wonderful film. We're introduced to the song All My Sadness, All My Joy, which is a really melancholy kind of circular tune, and the film itself has a circular feel. You know, you're in prison, you're out of prison, you're back in prison, you're out of prison. The film itself actually finishes with a circle of prisoners wandering around the yard. So the film has a kind of melancholy feel about it. The scenes in the prison are very well composed. There's a sense of claustrophobia. And again, there's great location work, which is one of Losey's strengths. If you look at the films we've discussed so far, he really has a good use of location. And again, lots of wonderful actors doing nice little bits. They might not have large roles, but they're all really effective. A great collection of faces. In the outside world, as with all of Losey's films, there's really nice production design, use of paintings, which is a common thing that you'll see in Losey films. And again, this is about a man who, you know, runs from the law, escapes from the law for a living, and wants to escape from his so-called partners in crime, which again, running or escaping is another theme in Losey films that I've talked about so far. This is the Studio Canal Vintage Classics Blu-ray. This has a really good commentary with Kat Ellinger. It just has a stills gallery. And again, you do watch it with the thought of, I wish I could actually see the 130-minute cut as opposed to the 98, because as Nazrin Prod correctly said in his video, you do have a feeling that this is a film that was cut, and that's certainly true. And as I say, by the time it got to America, it was cut even more. But But it's still a wonderful film. A great central performance by Baker, who, like I say, kind of, when we see him, he kind of revels in his physicality, revels in that kind of power. You know, people pay attention to him in the prison. He has lots of kind of pull amongst these interesting characters and archetypes that we see in quite a lot of prison films. And you do get the feeling in the outside world that he's perhaps not quite as confident, or not quite as comfortable, shall we say, with the rules of that business part of crime, that management part of crime, if you like. So it's another wonderful film by Losey, and this is the second out of 4 Stanley Baker collaborations with Losey. So hopefully you'll join me for part 12, which is another collaboration with Stanley Baker. So please let me know in the comments if you've seen The Criminal and what you think of it, and hopefully you'll join me again for part 12 of my Joseph Losey season. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.